Well, hello and welcome to the February 11, 2024 online sermon from Christian Fellowship Church. Christian Fellowship Church is located in Northwest Indiana, specifically Hammond, Indiana. We are Hammond's Bible Church. If you're in the area, please use the contact information at the end of this video to find out our location. You can use it to call us, email us, learn when our service times are. And when you do, and you come and you're visiting one of our services, you'll see that we desire to proclaim God's gospel, God's message, and teach the Bible in a systematic way, whether it's verse by verse or topic by topic, that's driven by the Word of God to give the meaning of what the text says. We use what is called the grammatical historical approach to the Bible, meaning we just use normal reading principles. If Jesus says he's a door, we understand that is a metaphor for as a description of his being an access way to heaven when he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. But if Jesus talks about the fact that unless a man is born again, he doesn't get into the kingdom of heaven, he is saying something that we need to understand literally, that he means exactly that. You must have a spiritual rebirth to come into the kingdom of God. So all of that to say, we would love for you to come and be a part of our service. You can see how we teach as we're going to be in the book of Esther chapter 9. We'll be there right after we transition in and out of our music ministry. This is the February 11th video. We are having our Super Sunday on this day, and if you're in the area, we would love for you to come and be a part of a special meal after our service. And we do that, S-O-U-P-E-R, soup. We love Super Sunday at Christian Fellowship Church. So hopefully, if you're in the area, you've seen this, come and be a part of our service. But enjoy our music, and then have your Bibles ready here.
as you are to worship. Oh, just as you are before your God. One day every tongue will confess you are God. One day every knee will bow. Still the greatest treasure remains for those who gladly trust you now. Come, now is the time to worship. Now is the time to give your heart. Just as you are to worship. Just as you are before your Now is the time to worship. Now is the time to give your heart. Just as you are to worship. Just as you are before your One day every tongue will confess you are God. One day every knee will bow. Still the greatest treasure remains. We gladly trust you now. One day every tongue will confess you are God. One day every knee will bow. Still the greatest treasure remains for those who gladly trust you now. Oh, now is the time to worship. Now is the time to give your heart. Come, just as you are to worship. Oh, just as you are before your
As we've been studying the book of Esther, we've been talking about the subject of the invisible hand of God. Now, if you haven't watched any of our videos up to now, understand that the invisible hand of God is a description of how God is involved in humans' lives when he is yet not seen. You know, we're not talking about when Jesus actually walked the earth, God became man, Jesus could be seen. Ironically, the book of 1 John opens up with what we saw, what we held, what our hands handled. But when we talk about the invisible hand of God, we are talking about how God gets involved in man's life, yet is not seen. And we've been talking about guardian angels from Psalm 91, how God sends angels to deal with events that people in the church today deal with, Hebrews 13, but we entertain them unawares. And so this concept is very much evident in the book of Esther, the book that never mentions God one time, but it is over and over and over accredited that God is the one active in the book of Esther. Now, when we talk about the invisible hand of God, there is something that explicitly needs to be identified, and that is that we do not live just in a physical world. We are talking about the invisible spiritual world, meaning there is a spiritual world that is all around us. And it is something that we all have to realize and understand. In the Bible, perhaps one of the most profound ways that this is ever demonstrated is in the book of 2 Kings chapter 6. I'm just going to cite the reference, but it is the reference when the king of Aram is coming against Israel, and his plans keep getting thwarted, and they tell him, hey, the reason is because the prophet Elisha is able to hear what you do in secret. And so he sends this army to Elisha, and when the attendant, the servant of Elisha, wakes up and he looks out and he sees the king of Aram's army surrounding them, he is overwhelmed. He is basically shaking at his knees. But then he turns to Elisha, and Elisha says, basically, cool your jets. And in 2 Kings chapter 6, he says, don't be afraid, for those who are with us are greater than those who are with them. And Elisha said, Lord, please open his eyes so that he may see. And then boom, the attendant sees all of these angels, these spiritual warriors on chariots and horses, all around in the hills. And it is used to bring the power of God into the situation. And if you want to find out how it goes on, you read 2 Kings chapter 6. But it is an image that I'm going to try and show the congregation on Sunday when I preach this message, because I got some slides to show the area with no angels, and then nothing but an army, and then all of a sudden, boom, the angels appear. Has to be incredible, had to be an incredible time when that actually happened for Elisha's servant. But here's the reality. That isn't just an Old Testament concept. We need to understand the spiritual world still exists. That's why we're told as New Testament saints in Ephesians 6 to fight the battle, the spiritual battles with spiritual armor. Hence, we want you to constantly, I want you to constantly be putting on the breastplate of righteousness, the belt of truth, right? The helmet of salvation, shodding your feet with the preparation of the gospel. That's a passage we're going to talk a little bit more later in this message, but it is critical that you understand we are in a spiritual battle and not just in a physical battle. And so as we come to our text today in Esther, we don't know how the spiritual world actually looked, but we are told that Israel wins a decisive battle and 75,000 enemies of Israel are killed, 75,000 plus, really. And the interesting thing, too, is even though we don't see the physical, we know that God was ultimately working behind the scenes. And so chapter 9 is going to basically tell us and play out how the events of Israel's defense of herself actually worked out. Now, if you haven't been with us, and this is your first study of the book of Esther, understand the book of Esther is a book that is historical in nature. It's not a made-up fairy tale. It occurred from about 484 BC to 473 BC. And as you come to the book of Esther, we are coming to the 9th chapter. And the 9th chapter is when this incredible battle is going to be played out that occurred all the way, that started, the impetus for this was in chapter 3 when this man named Hammond got the king of Persia, King Ahasuerus, to sign a decree to kill all the Jews of the world. And because Persia had this ridiculous rule that once a decree is made, it cannot be reversed, then once Haman was defeated in chapter 7, we had to come up with another plan, and that's what chapter 8 was, where the king says, hey, Mordecai, who was the cousin of our heroine, Esther, and our hero, Mordecai, come up with another plan, and that is to attack back. We're going to see how that plays out in chapter 9. Now, I've been emphasizing the fact that when we come to chapters 8, 9, and 10, it is not story over. It is the rest of the story. And because of that concept, where I don't want you to come to chapter 7 and say, oh my goodness, the story's over, Haman's been killed. We got to watch still how this plays out. And last few weeks, we've been looking at chapter 8 and looking at all that you can gather from that. Very, very, very impactful chapter. I think it's no different when we come to chapter 9. We're going to see the same thing. But I've been emphasizing the rest of the story. Hence, the slide that I show on Sundays will deal with the image of a old-time radio broadcaster, Paul Harvey. And he used to have a radio show called The Rest of the Story. And I've been trying to bring in stories that are relatable on ways that we can tie it into our story of Esther, so that we'll remember the rest of the story, so that when maybe if you ever think of these stories, you'll remember that Esther wasn't over come chapter 7. So here is another one, and I'm not going to give you the full account, but this is a Paul Harvey story, and it says, now the rest of the story. During the Civil War, when the North had the most to lose, a crucial decision was made to attack the Deep South by way of the Tennessee Valley. And the plan worked. And for the winning strategy, the history books credit Ben Wade. He was chairman of the Committee for the Conduct of the War. But Harvey says that credit is misplaced. Now, on another front, the capture of Vicksburg seemed a possible objective for the Union Army, because Vicksburg was a river port, and an attack from the water was seriously considered. But in the end, Vicksburg fell by a land attack, and Grant was praised for the plan. But again, someone else deserved the credit. In fact, a great many successful war strategies were conceived by an unsung strategist, a civilian advisor whom President Lincoln kept in the closet, a Southerner. And I thought, hey, it'd be great for us to talk about Lincoln because of the fact that we're coming close to President's Day, right? And here we are in February, and this message gets posted on February 11th. So this is fascinating for those of you who know, the Civil War, and you know how Grant was credited, and many of us wouldn't know Wade. But the idea is that there is an individual who was very instrumental in winning the Civil War, but they never got credit. And as Harvey goes on, he gives a lot of the details, and it's fascinating, all the battles that were won due to this strategist. And he says, the invaluable assistance to the Union cause received none of the much-deserved credit while the war was on. And when it was over and a bill was introduced in Congress that would award compensation for Lincoln's tactician, the bill was defeated. So the brilliant advisor, hailed by the Secretary of War Stanton as the one who did the great work that made the others famous, was left with little applause and no money, but then to spend the last years of life paralyzed and supported by a relative. So what was it that Congress was reluctant to recognize? Was it our technically unqualified civilian had maneuvered the military, or was it that a Southerner had done this for the North? What was it? What was it that this person did that the Union's best men could not accomplish? Was it because she was a woman? And the answer most likely is yes. Her name was Anna Ella Carroll. And Harvey says, and now you know the rest of the story. And I thought, how fascinating. I tried to check some sources, and I'm going to show a famous painting of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation that many of you might have seen. It was painted with Lincoln in the center, about 5 or 6 men around him, but there's an empty chair. You may never have caught it because of this bias to not mention Anna Ella Carroll. The painter painted an empty chair, and it's generally recognized this empty chair is for her, that she should have been recognized as the one who was the strategist. So fascinating, and I tied that in, just like I used the story last week, of the fact that here you got this woman who is critical to bringing about a major victory, just like Esther is. And now you know the rest of the story. Well, let's see how Esther's story plays out. Let's see the rest of the story, okay? So basically chapter 9, very long chapter, one of the longest chapters, if not the longest chapter in this book. It basically tells how the battle plays out and then recoups it with the holiday that Purim then becomes. So we pick up in verse 1, and it says, now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, when the king's command and edict were about to be executed, on a day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain mastery over them, it was turned to the contrary, so that the Jews themselves gained mastery of those who hated them. So here's this big summary of what basically the Jews were looking forward to being executed on this day, and this is in our calendars March 6th, 473 BC, that basically they were the ones who gained mastery. They won. That's the big picture summary. And it says in verse 2, the Jews assembled in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could stand before them, for the dread of them had fallen on all the peoples. We did a study on the fact that instead of saying the fear of God, the dread, the fear of the Jews, because ultimately behind the Jews, they believed there wasn't just a karma, there wasn't just a force, there was a God who was making all things work out for their good. And when this says the dread fell on these people, it flows into the next verse. And the next verse is basically that the people of the land of Persia, started helping the Jews. Look at verse 3. Even all the provinces, the princes of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and those who were doing the king's business, there's that key word, key verb, assisted the Jews, because the dread of Mordecai had fallen on them. Again, not saying fear of God. Mordecai, our Jewish number 2 man in all the kingdom, the fear of him. In the sense they believe that, they believe that God is behind him. And I think that's fascinating, because all the times I've studied the book of Esther, I don't know if I've emphasized this verse 3 enough. To me, this is critical. That when we look at how the Jews are going to be able to defeat their enemy, it's because the majority of the people in the community came to their aid under this second decree that Mordecai issued in the king's name. Verse 4, indeed, Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces, for the man Mordecai became greater and greater. Now remember, if Haman sets this decree to happen like in a month or 2 months, then a lot of this doesn't happen, and even the reputation of Mordecai doesn't grow. But remember, it's harder for us because we turn the page. We go from chapter 7 to chapter 8, that 7 months have occurred between chapter 7 and chapter 8. 7 months. So I believe Mordecai's reputation has grown and grown and grown, and more people are catching on to who he is. Hence, we want to support Mordecai. I believe he is probably a good administrator, a good government official. People are probably tired of Haman and his corruption, and they saw what kind of person he is. Plus, these people are recognizing the God of the Jews is behind Mordecai. We're going to support them. We're going to support the Jews. So, verse 5, thus the Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying, and they did what they pleased to do to those who hated them. I think that is a fascinating concept in this fact that you now have all these government officials, all these people supporting the Jews, and yet these people still attack the Jews. And it just shows to me how they were evil, how they were sinful, how they were basically illogical. I mean, why would they do this? Well, because they really hated the Jews and they really wanted to kill the Jews, even if it cost them their own life, and it actually does. So, we see at the citadel, Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. Long list of names. I'm going to try my best. Parashat, Datha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adaliah, Eridatha, Parmishtha, Erisai, Eridai, and Valtha, the 10 sons of Haman, the sons of Hamada, the Jews' enemy. But they did not lay hands on the plunder. And I believe those are those sons of Haman. And we learn that on the day, verse 11, that the number of those who were killed at the citadel were reported to the king. Now, by listing the names, by listing the people, again, historical accuracy, historical record, that people in this day and age, when they got this letter, some of these people would have been known. Again, always trying to emphasize that this is not a made-up story. So verse 12, the king said that Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman at the citadel in Susa. What then have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It shall even grant it to you. And what is your further request? It shall also be done. Now this is fascinating because the decree went out just for one day, but she's going to come back in response to this, and I believe this is the king working on her heart and not her being vindictive. Esther says, verse 13, if it pleases the king, let tomorrow also be granted to the Jews who are in Susa to do according to the edict of today, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. Why do I not think this is vindictive? Because I don't see her being vindictive. I don't see the Jews going to collect the plunder, getting the wealth off of these people. I believe she knows that there are still active enemies of the Jews, and it's going to give her an opportunity to get these people. So we see verse 14, the king commands that it should be done so, and an edict was issued in Susa, and Haman's 10 sons were hanged. Now, I don't know if these sons were already dead. There's some indication that they were already dead earlier, and the thought is they pulled them from the graves to make this a symbol of fear to the people. Don't mess around with the Jews. And so I think that's a fair assessment. Verse 15, the Jews who were in Susa assembled also on the 14th day of the month of Adar and killed 300 men in Susa, but they did not lay hands on the plunder. So you got 500 and 300, you got 800 people. Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces assembled to defend their lives and rid themselves of their enemies and kill 75,000 of them who hated them, but they did not lay hands on the plunder. Now you say 75,000, that's a lot, but remember, the estimate of the population of the kingdom at this time was 100 million people, 100 million plus. So you've got a very small percentage, but still you've got people who are attacking the Jews and want the Jews dead and would have been identified as enemies of the Jews. Verse 18, but the Jews who were in Susa assembled on the 13th day and the 14th day of the same month, and they rested on the 15th day and made it a day of feasting and rejoicing. So just a summary, okay? They attacked on 2 days, partied on the 3rd. Therefore, the Jews in the rural areas who lived in the north make the 14th day of the month of Adar a holiday for rejoicing and feasting and sending portions of food to one another. So the idea is, even though because they didn't attack on what would have been the 15th, they set their celebration on the 14th. So at this point, that's it. The battle's over. And what we've held is that Israel was defending themselves. This wasn't an aggressive attack by Israel in the sense, hey, let's just go kill our enemies. This is defense. And we'll talk more about that as we work through different principles in this. But it's from this point on that it sort of becomes a summary. If you're studying the book of Esther, it becomes a summary, a repeat of what happened. And so let me just read it. Verse 20, then Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, obliging them to celebrate the 14th day of the month of Adar and the 15th day of the same month annually. So 2 days for this feast. And because of these days, the Jews rid themselves of their enemies, and it was a month which turned for them from sorrow into gladness and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and rejoicing and sending portions of food to one another and gifts to the poor. Fascinating. This is one of the few holidays that becomes a regular tradition of the Jews that God never ordained. This comes from the situation of the events. And so indirectly, I would say because God's behind it, he allows for this to become a key part. But this is something that's not part of the law. But it is something, even to this day, the Jews celebrate. So verse 23, thus the Jews undertook what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the adversary of the Jews, had schemed against the Jews to destroy them and had cast pur, that is the lot, to disturb them and destroy them. Now, we cannot forget this. The idea of pur means to lot. And when Haman cast the lot, basically it was like these stones that had markings on them that sort of like functioned like our die. He determined that the best time to do this was on this date, 11 months ahead. But the key isn't just that he was rolling dice. The key is that he was appealing to his force, his God, those who control the invisible. Just like we were talking about, we live in a spiritual world, and even unbelievers can recognize this. And that's what Haman was appealing to. And yet the Bible has told us over and over that God controls even the casting of the lot, the casting of dice. So we can't miss this. We cannot miss this. So verse 25, when it came to the king's attention, he commanded by letter that this wicked scheme which he had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore, they call these days Purim, the days of Pur. And because of the instructions of the letter, both what they had seen in this regard and what happened to them, the Jews established and made a custom for themselves and for their descendants, and for all those who allied themselves with them, that they would not fail to celebrate these 2 days according to the regulation, according to their appointed time annually. And so even today they do it. Verse 28, so these days were to be remembered and celebrated through every generation, every family, and every province, and every city. And these days of Purim were not to fail from among the Jews or their memory, or fade from their descendants. Now, this is sort of like, I believe God's working through this. This is working through the situation that the Jewish people are to always remember when they were at one of the lowest times in human history. Remember their exiles. They had, if this plan goes forward, they couldn't have won. You had 100,000 people, maybe against 10 million people, and the Jews also were exiles. They didn't have the resources. This was all indicative of the fact that God had his hand on the Jews, and they were to remember it. I think we're going to talk about this, but it's not wrong to celebrate and remember and to have traditions. So, verse 28, so those days were to be remembered and celebrated throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, and these days of Purim were not to fail among all those Jews or their memory from their descendants. Then Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, that we learned about her father, with Mordecai the Jew, her cousin, Abihail would have been her uncle, his uncle, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about the Purim. You don't want to miss this. This is the second letter. Now the queen is affirming this, that it isn't just coming from the second in command. And so he sent letters to all the Jews, to the 170 provinces of Ahasuerus. So the queen with Mordecai are writing this letter, these words of peace and truth, to establish the days of Purim at their appointed times, just as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had established for them, and just as they established for themselves and for their descendants, with instructions for their times and fasting and lamentations. Like, man, this is like driving this home, and that's the point. Then the command of Esther established these customs for Purim, and it was written in the book. And so you get the point. I mean, when you look at verse 20 down to verse 32, there's this incredible emphasis on making sure we don't forget. We don't forget. Kind of like a little tie-in when you think of communion. It's sort of like a tangible way to always remember Christ. There's a tangible remember to always remember how God came through for Purim with the celebration of this holiday. And so here's the story. This is how it played out. Again, we're never told about how any angels or any invisible angels on chariots made a fight for this. But we know God was sovereign. We don't know how many Jews, if any, even died in this. But this was a complete and resounding victory for people who were weak, people who were exiles, people who didn't have the power to win this battle. And yet God turned the tables on an evil man. So we're going to work through a series of 8 principles that I pulled from this. And once again, I think there's some application for us. We're going to just go through 2 of the principles in this study, and then we'll come back with the other principles in our next study on this. What we have, first and foremost, I just reiterate it, and I put it in a fill in the blank. And so if you're watching this video and you would like the sermon notes, email the church and we'll send those out to you. But the principle is that God blesses Israel's self-protection. In essence, the protection, but in this case, I want to emphasize, as Israel is often not the aggressor, even like we see in Gaza today, they're responding. God does bless, and God blessed their self-protection. Remember to honor her. And I can't emphasize this enough. Remember, the book of Esther has a lot of principles in it, but the overarching principle is this one, that God has his hand on the nation of Israel. And without us turning back to Genesis 12, when God called Abraham, at that time Abram, but he becomes Abraham, he's one man. And I think when you go and you look at passages like Ezekiel 16 that describe what it was as Israel was birthed, as it will, They weren't the most powerful. It was almost like an abhorrent baby, if I could say that, in a way that it was. You get this description in Ezekiel chapter 16 that Israel wasn't even worthy to be picked as a baby, but yet it was because God was the one who was sovereignly choosing Israel, and we must never ever forget that. As much as like sometimes Israel's not perfect, we must remember that our recognition of Israel is because God picked them. And when you acknowledge that and you honor Israel and you pray for them and you give deference in any way you can to the Jewish people, it is because you're recognizing not that they're always worthy, because even Ezekiel 16 shows they're not always worthy, but that it's because God picked them. And because God picked them, they are the chosen people. And when I've talked to people who have animosity towards the Jews, it isn't just that they don't like Jewish people, they don't like God. That's the reality. We as Christians who have come to faith in Jesus Christ, the future Jewish ruler of the world, we must take the application to remember to honor her, honor the nation of Israel. And I just encourage you, as we watch life play out in Gaza, and we watch the conflict around the world and people turning on the Jews, you must remember where world history is going, where at one point the entire world will come to attack and try to destroy the world, to destroy every Jewish person. What Hammond started will not be the end, even though he was finished. There's a man coming called the Antichrist, and his goal is to wipe out all the Jews. But he too will fail. And you must remember that. And God knows your heart, your thoughts, your attitude towards the Jews. So, when we look at the story, we look at how Israel defeated 75,000 people, we must remember they were self-protecting themselves. They weren't the aggressors in this. And it just reminds us, though, that God was there to protect them. They were not going to be wiped out. Second, we need to remember physical battles are also spiritual battles. Use spiritual armor in the physical battles. Fill in with the blank spiritual twice. We are in a spiritual battle. And now you can turn to Ephesians chapter 6 in the New Testament. You say, I'm a New Testament saint. I don't come out with Elisha and I don't look on the hills, and see massive armies around me. But here's the reality. As God is wrapping up this incredible book in Ephesians, and he says in verse 10, finally be strong in the Lord in the strength of his might. Okay? Put on the full armor of God so that you may be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. I think it's critical that we recognize that the devil is constantly coming after us. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against powers, against the world forces of darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. God is saying, look and see. Like if you go home and your house was filled with demonic spirits, or you were going down the street and you saw a whole horde of a demonic army, your awareness would be like, hey, I need to be on my toes. Well, that's what God is like letting us know. We're not just in a physical world. We are in a spiritual battle. So therefore, verse 13, take up the full armor of God so that you'll be able to resist in the evil day, having done everything to stand firm. Hold your ground. These are military terms. Hold your ground, meaning I'm going to stay faithful as a Christian. I'm not going to give in. I'm not going to give in to sin. I'm not going to go down into temptation. I'm not going to practice evil. Stand firm, having girded your loins with truth. Put truth. Make the Bible something that is important to you. The Word of God is truth. Thy word is truth. Put on the breastplate of righteousness. The only way we are righteous is through Jesus Christ. And yet we can practice it because we're born again. And if you're unaware with the gospel, it's that man's a sinner, that Jesus was God and man who died on the cross. He was somebody who paid a penalty that we couldn't. His resurrection proved that the payment was received. And by faith alone, we believe in him. And faith is not mere agreement, it's a commitment. And when you get born again through this gospel, God allows you to be somebody that you have the ability to now practice righteousness. And because you can practice righteousness, you can be stronger in the Lord. So verse 15, then shod your feet with the preparation of the gospel. Remember where you stand, that your position with the gospel has allowed you to have a strong position with God. I think sometimes people forget and don't understand that God is for them. That's what shodding your feet is. You're firmly planted in the gospel. In addition, take up the shield of faith. So practice your faith, put your faith into practice, which you'll be able to extinguish the flaming arrows of the evil one. Do you recognize that the evil one is aggressively coming after you? He isn't somebody that is sitting there, well, I'm not going to throw anything at them. No, I'm going to throw flaming arrows. Whether it is lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and boastful pride of life. And then take up the helmet of salvation, assurance of salvation. And for those in our area, I am doing a study on March 9th from 10 a.m. to noon to help people get assured about their salvation. It's one of the most important doctrines we have. And I believe that people who do not teach on assurance of salvation are making a massive error, and that it's greatly causing harm to the church. But assurance of salvation, and then the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of truth. In a sense, being aggressive with the word. Not only is it something that is wrapped around you, the truth, with the belt of truth, but now you got this sword and you're aggressive. And with all prayer, petition, right, at all times in the Spirit, with this alert, with all perseverance and petition for the saints, and pray on my behalf. So prayer is a critical part of this defense. So you go back to the book of Esther, and I want you to understand physical battles are still around. And this deals with your character, your practices, your life. And I've used this illustration every day. I've used this illustration often when we talk about putting on the armor of God. But, when we watch army movies and you watch a soldier go out into battle and they put their armament on, helmets, any type of body gear, body armor, it would be foolish for them to say, I'm going out and I'm not going to wear a helmet today, or I'm not going to wear any body armor. I'm not even going to take my gun today. If I see the enemy, I'll just run up, maybe I'll punch him. No, in this day and age of aggressive warfare, guns, cannons, whatever, you got to be properly equipped. And, when you watch a movie and you see somebody not properly prepared, it's like, oh no, it's almost like foreshadowing. Well, to me, if you're not going out every day, there's a foreshadowing that you're going out every day with your armor on, you're going to be beat up because Satan is not passive. We are not living in a morally neutral world. Not only are we living in a spiritual world, but we're living in a morally aggressive world towards evil. So I hope we learned from this. So we'll get into the other principles going forward. But let's remember, we live in a spiritual world. Yes, it's a physical world, but it's a spiritual world. And the story of Elisha is not just for an Old Testament life. It's not something that we can say, oh, there's no demons around today. There are. Now, I'm not telling you that, like Neil Anderson, where you brought something demonic in your home. No, that's ridiculous. But and maybe I opened up a can of worms there. But a man named Neil Anderson wrote a book called The Bondage Breaker that was just made up stories, and he really, I think, was a great detriment to the church. But what I am telling you to do is to look at what Ephesians 6 says, and that's how you have to do your battle, knowing that this spiritual world is all around you. And look, you may not always get credit for how you fight for your own life, for your own family, or this church. And you may be like an Anna Ella Carroll, okay, who does a lot of great things and never gets the credit. But I tell you, one great thing I can tell you is that God sees and knows everything that you do. So Esther got esteemed. Esther did what was right. She rose up for such a time as this. Well, it's such a time as this. As I've been talking over the past few weeks, we have to be in the end times because Israel's been regathered. And as I've studied it and I've looked at it, Israel is never going to be dispersed. This is it, people. And as we continue to see events in Gaza and around Israel and the world focusing on them, all of our awareness needs to be heightened. We need to be aware that everything is pushing us every day, let alone the events of every day are pushing us closer to the return of Jesus Christ. The rapture of the church was right around the corner. The reality of the tribulation being right around the corner. All the events are coming together. And so I ask, are you ready? Are you ready for such a time as this?